On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help, but because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing, 90 miles away, full-time. And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now, Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate, and as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning, and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition. Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows, arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird. Because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do. Because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by, and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious, and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone, and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in Sealing. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, "Don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it." But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, "Is Mom home?" And Tad said, "No, she's still not here." Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, "We gotta call the police." 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So, Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now, Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed, and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, he said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy, could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like some place if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, So on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend, repeatedly, to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble, to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise, because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend, because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed, as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him, and Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that his plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere, and then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. He expected her to come home. This couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janet Dennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer, Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach, like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, "Where were you on Friday night?" which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday. And now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill, because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, "Yep, Jim failed his test," which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. Because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with huge adoration. They really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around Sealing that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes. But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, hey, would you mind taking this test again? But Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left: to sign a consent to search form, which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, "Sure." The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Under Sheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire. And it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt the surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that this woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel, and she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news, because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out. Nobody knew what happened to Janet. She had not turned up. It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, He wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of like the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy, who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then, a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, "I have more information about Janet, and it might be important." And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. On the afternoon of Wednesday, April 12, 2006, Dr. John Yelnick finished up his final exam of the day at his dental practice in the rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He handed his patient a toothbrush, told her to come back in 6 months, and then headed into his back office to wrap up. He turned off his computer and made sure he had everything he needed. The next day was his day off, and he didn't want to have to come back because he forgot something. Once he was satisfied, he flicked off the light, walked out through reception, and told the receptionist to have a great night. She waved, and he gave her a big smile. But as soon as John walked out the front door, he let the smile drop off his face. He had a lot of problems recently, and pretending to be happy all day was pretty exhausting. And just because he'd finished work for the week did not mean he could relax now. In fact, it was the opposite. Because waiting for John back at home was a legal document that he could barely even stand to look at. But he knew that tomorrow he was finally going to have to deal with it. John had been trying to psych himself up for this, telling himself it would mark the beginning of a new phase of his life, but it was still very painful. He got into his car, turned on the ignition, pulled out of the parking lot, and began making his way home. It was about a half-mile drive from the dental practice to his house. Blairsville was a tiny little borough, just like a town, not far from Pittsburgh, and it was mostly farmland, with rolling fields of corn and less than 3,500 residents. John had actually grown up here and then left at some point. But it had always been his lifelong dream to eventually come back home and raise a family here. When he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have set up shop in a big city and made a much higher salary right off the bat. But instead, he took what was, to him, an even better deal. He joined the practice of his own childhood dentist, right in downtown Blairsville. And it would turn out that John actually was able to make a lot of money right here in his hometown. Once John joined this practice, the practice took off, in part because John himself was incredibly charming and funny, and especially good with kids. He became the go-to dentist for whole families, and pretty soon he was earning more than he could even spend. He invested in real estate and eventually became a millionaire by the time he was in his 30s. But it was not until John met his wife, Michelle, that his life finally felt complete. John thought Michelle was one of the most beautiful people in the world. She had dark curly hair and striking blue eyes. When he met her, she was a single mother of 2, and to John, that was great, because it meant, basically, she came with a ready-made family. Now, John's friends were worried that Michelle only wanted John for his money, but when his mom got sick with cancer, Michelle immediately became her full-time caregiver. And for John, that was all the proof he needed that she did truly love him. John and Michelle got married in 1997, and shortly after that, they adopted a little boy named JJ and then moved into a big house with a pool. Everything had seemed perfect. But now, John pulled into his new driveway, turned off the ignition, and just sat there, staring at the modest little brick home where he was currently living. He still couldn't understand how everything had fallen apart so completely. John was suddenly tight on money, and his childhood dentist, who was now his business partner, was talking about dissolving their partnership. John had lent tens of thousands of dollars to a bunch of people, and now he was having to ask for it back. And he and Michelle had hit a rough patch that just didn't end, and they both admitted to having affairs. They were now living separately, which was why John was here at this small house, instead of coming home to his big house with the pool. But of all the stressors in John's life, the worst one, by far, was that John was absolutely convinced that someone was going to murder him. Now, this fear had not come totally out of nowhere. A couple of weeks earlier, someone had vandalized John's car with spray paint, and the police had not been able to figure out who did it. And with all the other bad stuff going on in John's life, John had not been able to get over this vandalism. And he slowly became 100% certain that because of this vandalism, it signaled that he was going to get killed, and his murder, like the vandalism, would go unsolved. And he became so sure of this that he sent his attorney $10,000 and told her to use it to investigate if he just suddenly wound up dead. John finally got out of his car and walked up his porch steps and into the house. Then he closed the door behind him and locked it. It felt so empty now without his adopted son, JJ, who John went long stretches without seeing these days. John had renovated one of the upstairs bedrooms for JJ, who was 5 years old, and he even bought a TV and video game console for them to play together that he was going to give him at Christmas. But Christmas had long passed, it was now April, and those Christmas gifts he had bought for JJ were still sitting unopened in a corner. This coming weekend was Easter, and John was hoping to finally see JJ again and give him these late Christmas presents. That would cheer him up. John took off his shoes and walked into his living room. There, on the coffee table, he saw the legal document that he had been avoiding, because it represented the end of the life he had worked so hard to build. The document was a stack of divorce papers. Michelle had filed for divorce 3 years earlier in 2003, but she and John hadn't been able to come to an agreement. They were not fighting to save the marriage. Both of them knew it was broken beyond repair. Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. What John and Michelle were fighting over was JJ. Michelle wanted full custody, but John was not about to just give up his son. But in less than 24 hours, it would all be over. Their lawyers had finally settled on a shared custody agreement, and Michelle had signed it. Tomorrow, it would be John's turn. And the finality of it all was really starting to hit John. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, but he was feeling too restless to watch. So he called his aunt, who he was very close to, and he talked with her for a while about the divorce. She tried to make him feel better, but there really wasn't much she could say that would do that. And then when he put the phone down, John just sort of felt like, you know what, I just have to find a way to get through tomorrow, no matter how bad it is. He knew what he should be doing right now is actually reading through the divorce papers one more time, but he was just too tired. So he just stretched out on the couch and fell asleep. And when his back door creaked open, he didn't even hear it. The following day, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Use, who lived next door to John, walked out the front door of his parents' house and across the lawn towards John's house. It was a warm and sunny day, and Zach wanted to play with John's son, JJ. Now, JJ hadn't been around for quite a while, but he did split time between his mother and father's homes, and so Zach had no idea if JJ was here today, but he figured it was worth a shot. But before Zach even climbed up the front steps to John and JJ's house, he saw that something was wrong. There was broken glass all over the porch in front of the door. Zach paused for a second and scanned the porch, looking for where this glass came from, and he noticed the little glass panel to the left of the door had been shattered. When he squinted, he realized there were streaks of red liquid dried right underneath the broken panel and also in the glass itself. Suddenly, Zach's throat got tight and his pulse quickened, and he thought about running away. But he couldn't just leave his friend JJ and his dad if they were in some kind of trouble. So Zach slowly and nervously climbed up the steps to the door and tried the doorknob. But he found it was locked. As carefully as he could, Zach stuck his hand through the broken glass panel and reached up and unlocked the deadbolt. Then he pulled his arm back out, turned the doorknob, and opened the door. At first, when Zach stepped inside the house, he couldn't really process what he was even looking at. There were papers strewn all over the floor, and Zach could clearly see JJ's dad. But JJ's dad, John, was laying motionless face up on the floor inside the living room. It took Zach a second to realize that the floor all around John was soaked with blood. And when Zach looked more closely at John, he realized John's throat had been slit from ear to ear. Zach turned and ran. About 15 minutes later, Janelle Leidick of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was driving with her husband and 4 kids when she got a call from police dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally quiet residential street. Dispatch just said there apparently had been a cardiac arrest, and so Corporal Leidick was needed right now at the scene. Corporal Leidick tried to get more information to determine, how urgent this was, but there really wasn't any more information. And so she made the decision to just go straight there with her family still in her car. But the second she pulled up at the scene and got out of her car, she could tell that this could not just be a heart attack, because she could see there was a patrol officer waiting for her on the porch, and his face looked grim. Lydic quickly walked towards him and asked what was going on, and he just pointed at the broken glass and the blood on the porch and then told her, just go inside and see for yourself. So Lydic, who was pretty apprehensive at this point, stepped inside the house, and she saw the foyer was splashed with blood all over the floor and the walls, and there, lying on the ground in the middle of the living room, was a horribly mutilated dead body. Right away, Lydic knew this had to be a murder, not only because the body was mutilated, but because she could clearly see numerous stab wounds all over the body, so many that there was no way this person could have self-inflicted. And even though Lydic had never handled a homicide case before, she knew immediately that what she needed right now was backup. Because dispatch had somehow recorded this 911 call as a cardiac arrest, the police had not sent a full emergency response, and so Lydic and the patrol officer outside were the only people on the scene. Lydic was worried that the killer could still be in the area, or maybe in the house. And now she realized she had brought her kids with her. So she sent the patrol officer into the house to search it, while she went back outside to the front yard to stand between the murder scene and her family, guarding them with her gun. It was not long before a fleet of police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances descended on this quiet residential street. At the same time, the patrol officer who had searched the house came outside to report that it was empty. The killer, whoever they were, was gone. The only thing the officer had found was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where the victim clearly had bled through from the floor above. Once her backup arrived on scene and she had sent her family home, Corporal Lydic went back inside the house to assess just what kind of crime scene she was looking at. By now, she had the victim's name, John Yelnick. As the crime scene technicians started their work processing the physical evidence, Lydic began a slow walk through each room, trying to get a sense of who John was and how he died. John's body was close to the front door, but it was clear that the attack that preceded his death had been long and chaotic. There was blood all over the floor in the living room, which was strewn with papers. And when Lydic looked more closely, she realized these papers were divorce papers, and they too were covered in blood. Despite John being found barefoot, there were bloody shoe prints leading from the living room through the dining room towards the back door. They were too big to belong to the boy who had found the body, so Lydic figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene technicians were already measuring the prints to determine the killer's shoe size. As Lydic continued to walk around, she didn't see anything that she thought could have been used as a murder weapon. She also didn't see any evidence of a robbery. The electronics that she could see were out in the open, so they weren't taken. No drawers or cabinets appeared to have been opened, and none of the closets looked like they had been rifled through. And so to Lydic, it really did not appear that this was a robbery. Not only because of what she was seeing in terms of things not being taken, but also, more specifically, just how gruesome the crime was. I mean, to stab someone over and over and over again and mutilate their bodies, that is personal. That's not just some robber who happened upon John in the process of the robbery. So very likely, whoever the killer was, the only thing they wanted to do when they entered this home was for John to die. Lydic finished her sweep of the scene, ending up back in the living room, where it looked to her like the attack had most likely begun. And that's when she noticed a check lying on the coffee table. She had overlooked it somehow before, but now she bent over to read it. The check was made out to the victim, John Yelnick, for the amount of $15,000 from the bank account of somebody named Melissa Use. When she saw this last name, Lydic did a double take. Use was the last name of the boy, the neighbor, who had discovered the body. She wondered if Melissa Use was related to that boy. Attached to this check was also a note asking John to hold off for a few days before depositing it. And so at this point, Corporal Lydic had two good leads. The first lead was her victim clearly was in the middle of a divorce. And the second lead was someone, maybe his next door neighbor, whoever this Melissa Use person was, owed him a lot of money that apparently she could not quite afford to pay back just yet. It was evening by the time Lydic stepped back outside the house, and when she did, she saw a crowd of neighbors and reporters jostling each other on the street. Blairsville almost never had murders, and she knew this was going to be a big story. She needed to head back to the station to get organized for interviews tomorrow. But before she could walk down the steps, one of the other officers on scene came up to her with an update. Police had fanned out to question the neighbors and see if they had heard anything, and they'd come back with two very interesting stories. The first account came from a woman who said that around 1:30 that morning, she had heard a scream. It woke her up, and she had run to check on her kids, but her kids had been fine, so she had just gone back to bed, thinking she was just being jumpy. The second account came from another neighbor who had heard something a bit more specific. Right around the same time that first neighbor had heard the scream, or maybe a little bit after that, this neighbor heard a man yelling in what sounded like a heated argument. The neighbor couldn't make out everything the man said, but they definitely heard one sentence very clearly, and that was, "I'll never loan you money again." Instantly, Leidick thought of the $15,000 check on the coffee table. The officer had one more important piece of information for Leidick. In addition to these witness statements, a lot of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one family on the block that detectives should really look into, and that was the Use family. The Use boy, Zach, was the one who found the body, and it was his mother, Melissa Use, whose name was on that check. And there was one more member of the Use family, and that was Melissa's husband, Tom. Tom was in the Navy, and he was away a lot, but over the last 24 hours, he had been home, so he was here when John was killed. Critically, the neighbors told the cops that there were rumors that Melissa Use and John Yelnick were having an affair. And so when Leidick heard this, she knew exactly where her investigation was going to start. The following day, April 14th, Leidick had Melissa and Tom Use brought down to the station and put in an interview room for questioning. At this point, so early in the investigation, Leidick was casting a very wide net. She had never done a murder case before, but she was methodical by nature and liked to do everything slowly and thoroughly. She even talked slowly in a kind of monotone voice, and she didn't like it when anyone tried to rush her. So her plan was to go pretty hard at Melissa and Tom Use because of that $15,000 check, the rumors of the affair, and the witness account of a fight about loaned money on the night of the murder. But Leidick was also very interested in John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle. The night before, Leidick had sent a police officer to tell Michelle that her husband was dead. But when the officer got to Michelle's house, he found that she somehow already knew, although she said she had heard that John died of a heart attack. The officer had broken the news to Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin Foley, who was there, that no, John had actually been murdered. And when he told them that, Michelle had seemed, or at least acted, genuinely shocked. Corporal Leidick actually knew Michelle's boyfriend Kevin Foley personally, because he was a state police trooper, they had worked together, and at one point she had quite literally trusted him with her life. But in a murder case, the divorcing spouse and their new partner are always suspects number 1 and 2, and Leidick knew that. However, before she began grilling Kevin or Michelle with some hard questions, she decided she would first eliminate all other suspects. She also wanted to get the results of the autopsy, which was being conducted that day. Basically, she wanted to be really thorough before she went in on Kevin and Michelle. So now, Leidick walked into the interview room where John's neighbors, Melissa and Tom Use, were waiting side by side at a table. Leidick sat down and began very bluntly by asking what was the deal with that $15,000 check Melissa had written to John. Melissa answered in a very shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been friends since 9th grade and she was planning to open up a new bakery in town. And John had loaned her the $15,000 to help her out, but then sort of out of nowhere, he had asked for the money back. Melissa said she had been very disappointed, but at the same time, she knew John was in the middle of a long and probably quite expensive divorce, so she understood. She'd only had $14,000 in her account when she wrote that check, and so she had said that's why she'd left that note for John, asking him not to cash it for a few days while she got the last $1,000 together. Leidick watched Melissa closely as she gave her statement, and she decided that if Melissa was lying, she was doing a very convincing job of it. She sounded genuinely distraught over John's death, and like the money really didn't matter given the context. But for Leidick, the obvious warmth that Melissa felt for John raised another, more sensitive question. And in her typically blunt way, Leidick didn't dance around it, even though Melissa was sitting there right next to her husband, Tom. Leidick looked right at Melissa and said, "Were you having an affair with John?" Melissa instantly went red and said no, She said they were close friends, but nothing more. Leidick turned to Melissa's husband, Tom. He looked very uncomfortable, but Leidick didn't care. She asked him the same thing. Is Melissa having an affair with John? For a second, Tom didn't say anything, and Leidick wasn't really sure what to expect. This kind of question could be so offensive to some people or just plain hurtful. But when Tom spoke, he didn't sound angry or upset. He refused to answer Leidick directly and instead just kept repeating over and over again that he really needed to leave to go take care of the kids. And that persisted basically for the rest of their interview. He just didn't answer her question. And so by the time Leidick just wrapped it up and told Melissa and Tom Hughes they could go, Tom had firmly established himself, at least in Leidick's mind, as a clear person of interest. Before Leidick left the station for the day, she checked in with one of her police officers who she had sent to go observe the autopsy of her victim. The officer told her that the forensic pathologist had determined that the killer had used a one-sided blade to repeatedly slash John during a fight that must have been at least a few minutes long. John had clear defensive wounds on his hands as well as cuts on his back, which suggested he'd tried to run away. And in addition to the knife wounds, his jugular had also been cut by glass. It was an absolutely brutal way to kill someone. Everyone that Leidick and her officers had spoken to had described John Yelnick in glowing terms. He was a simple guy who loved classic movies and old music and liked to dance the polka even though he was terrible at it. At his dental practice, his favorite patients were the kids, who he could always make laugh. He was a devoted dad who loved going to his stepson's hockey games. It just didn't square with the violence described in the autopsy report. Somebody had hated him enough to basically hack him to death in a wild frenzy. Corporal Leidick felt like she had one very good suspect in Tom Hughes. I mean, he had acted very suspicious in the interview, and because he didn't answer the question about the affair, maybe he thought his wife was having an affair with John, and that's why he attacked John. However, because Leidick had never done a homicide investigation before, she was very weary of not focusing too hard on one lead or one suspect. She wanted to keep her mind open and make sure she didn't miss anything. Also, she wanted to appear capable in front of her superiors and show them that she was running down every possible lead. And this brought up another concern that Leidick had, and that was she didn't want to share her investigation with any other police agency. The officer who had gone to the autopsy had come back with John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and tissue samples, which Leidick was supposed to send to a state police lab for DNA testing. But now that Leidick had them, she didn't want to give them to anybody else. And Leidick was a pretty stubborn person. So, to keep her investigatory options open, and to guarantee that she knew every single thing going on with her evidence, she decided not to send the samples to the state police lab. Instead, she put them in the department refrigerator and went home. The following day was April 15th, 2 days after John Yelnick was murdered. And Corporal Leidick had decided to start her day at John's dental practice, speaking to his colleagues. She had already had her officers canvass John's neighborhood. That's how she'd gotten the witness statement about the fight over a loan, and also she had heard about the rumors centered on the Hughes family. Now she wanted to know how other people in John's life viewed him. And as soon as she arrived at John's office, she was glad she had come, because the dental hygienists and the receptionist had a lot to say about John's soon-to-be ex-wife, Michelle Yelnick. This was because during the long, awful, drawn-out fight John and Michelle had over their divorce, Michelle had at some point lodged allegations against John that he abused their adopted son JJ. Even Michelle's own family hadn't believed her, and officials had declined to press charges. But at one point during the back and forth, Michelle had also accused John of violating a stay-away order, and police had come and arrested him at work. John's colleagues thought Michelle was a total nightmare. She called the office all the time to demand money, and John often caved and gave it to her. In fact, one of the hygienists told Corporal Leidick that Michelle had called just a few days before the murder. However, this time, John had refused to speak to her. This detail caught Leidick's ear. A lot of John's friends had described Michelle as money-hungry. They said it was Michelle who wanted the huge house and the pool, and that John really never felt comfortable living in such a nice place. He still drove an old car with 100,000 miles on it. It was like when he got rich, he didn't know how to act rich. But Michelle definitely did, and John's friends and colleagues said that was a big part of what ultimately drove the couple apart. Now, Leidig did not believe Michelle was physically capable of murdering John the way he was killed. I mean, clearly, John was overpowered and brutalized. However, she did have enough money to potentially hire someone to do it for her. And adding more credibility to that theory, Leidig's team had just pulled the paperwork on John's life insurance policy, and they discovered that it listed Michelle as the beneficiary. And with his death, she stood to inherit more than $1 million. The dental hygienists and the receptionist at John's practice didn't know of any other money disputes John was having. And they said he got on well with his business partner, regardless of any conversations they might have had about, splitting up their practice. Their suspicions were aimed squarely at Michelle. And now, so were Corporal Leidig's. She was not ready to write off Tom Use. I mean, he was clearly a main suspect. But it sort of felt like she now had two major suspects, Tom and Michelle. As Leidig left the dental office, she thought about how she was going to approach Michelle. Given the sensitivity of the fact that Michelle was dating a cop, Leidig did not want to make her move too soon, without enough ammunition. After all, this was the biggest case she had ever worked. Reporters were calling her constantly, everybody was asking her about it, and so the last thing she wanted to do was act prematurely and screw this thing up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after his murder. And Corporal Leidig knew that his friends and family were already beginning to get antsy about why this investigation seemed to be moving so slowly. But she did understand where they were coming from. After all, John himself had been convinced he was about to be murdered and that the case would never be solved, and he was very vocal about it. And so Leidig could see that it was starting to look to the people that loved him like his prediction was coming true. But Leidig also felt like John's friends and family simply didn't understand. Leidig was being careful, not just slow. She was a perfectionist, and she wanted to do the investigation her way. Without any departmental guidance on how to actually work a homicide, she had developed a method of her own. She knew that some homicide detectives like to start their investigations with the people closest to their victim, but Leidig was going to focus on the outside edges of the case and work her way in. She felt like this was the most methodical approach. So, for the next several months, Leidig did that and took her time. The crime scene unit had not turned up any matchable DNA or fingerprints at the scene, and the bloody footprints they found didn't belong to any of Leidig's suspects. Leidig still had not turned in the evidence she had stored in the Blairsville refrigerator, so for now, she was relying on interviews. Leidig ran down every single tip and rumor she found, systematically ruling things out one by one. She had heard talk that John's partner in the dental practice wanted to stop working together, so she questioned him, but quickly ruled him out. Just like the hygienist and the receptionist at the practice had said, the men were close friends with no bad blood. They just maybe didn't want to work together. Leidig had heard lots of talk about how generous John was, so she tracked down every single person she could who John had lent money to. One of those people was John's cousin, Tracy Jacobs. Tracy had borrowed $20,000 to start a lawn care business, and so Leidig brought Tracy down to the station to take a lie detector test. But Tracy passed. And as spring became summer, that was just how it went. Leidig brought one person after another down to the station, made them take lie detector tests, and then scratched them off her list. As she did this, she kept tabs on her two best suspects, Tom Use and Michelle Yelnick, but she made no move to arrest either one. Sometimes the complaints from the public and from John Yelnick's family about her failure to solve the case quickly did get to her, but she felt like she was doing the best job she could. She was doing this maybe a little bit unorthodox, but she felt like she was on the right path. That was until Melissa Use hired a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder, when Corporal Leidig got a call from Melissa Use. Leidig had been surprised to hear from Melissa, and even more surprised when Melissa told her she wanted to meet at John's house. When Leidig showed up, Melissa was standing on the sidewalk with two older women who she introduced as psychic sisters. She said she had met them at a psychic tea party, and they had visions about this case. Now, Leidig admittedly was not thrilled at the idea of psychics potentially getting involved in this case. I mean, she felt like, how could they possibly advance this case? She was already all over it. Why do we need them? But she also knew that John's family was getting really edgy, and apparently they had given Melissa permission to bring these psychics into John's house and look around, and so if Leidig wanted more time to work on this case, she just needed to placate them. And so if that meant working with psychics contacted by one of the suspect's wives, then that was what Leidig was going to do. So Leidig trailed Melissa Use and the psychic sisters, tried not to roll her eyes, as the sisters began walking through John's yard. First, the sisters said they felt some hot and also cold patches on the property. When they walked up the stairs and went inside, they looked around the house, which had not been cleaned out after the murder, and said they thought the killing happened in the dining room area, which was still spattered with blood. The psychic said they saw a knife and stab wounds and a bloody footprint, and then they said the killer drove a black or red car and that the killer was not Melissa Use's husband, Tom. Melissa looked visibly excited by everything the psychics were saying, but Leidig thought it was totally ridiculous. The blood inside the house made it pretty obvious where the killing had happened, and the huge police investigation that followed had been all over the news. And so the things they were pointing out about, what could have happened in the house were sort of public knowledge. And then the fact that these psychics, who remember, Melissa herself has brought here, like she's commissioned these psychics, are now exonerating Melissa's husband, was just not very convincing. And so as the group walked out of the house, the only thing Leidig thought these psychics had been good for was taking some of the pressure off her slow but steady investigation. She knew that by this point, John Yelnick's family had lost faith in her. But she still had one more thing she wanted to try. She just needed to wait for the right time. And 10 months after the murder, in February of 2007, Corporal Leidig got her chance. John's cousins made an impassioned plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office to take over the investigation from Corporal Leidig. Leidig's cooperation with the psychics had bought her a little bit of goodwill and time with the families, but ultimately, both John's family and Melissa Use had gotten more and more agitated by Leidig's slow pace. They began to feel like the psychics had given them as much information as Leidig had. And the Attorney General agreed. Not enough progress was being made. This meant that Leidig was losing her case. And on one hand, this was exactly the thing that she'd been most worried about, that some bigger agency would come in and take over her investigation. But the Attorney General's office was not the agency Leidig had expected to do that. And so now, even though it stung, Leidig realized that she could finally make the play she had been sitting on for almost a year. She went to the refrigerator in the Blairsville police station and she took out the container of fingernail clippings that her officer had brought back from John Yelnick's autopsy, which had been conducted the day after the murder. Leidig had been supposed to send the fingernails along with the other tissue samples to the state police crime lab, but in what she knew was probably a breach of protocol, she had not done that. Instead, she had hidden them in this fridge. But now, with the Attorney General very publicly stepping in and getting involved in this case, it sort of made the case much more high profile, which in turn allowed Leidig to send these samples directly to the Federal Crime Lab or the FBI Crime Lab. Normally, the FBI would just not take samples for a small-town murder case, which is what this was all the way up until this point. But again, the case was not that anymore. The Attorney General stepping in and taking over had elevated this case, giving Leidig access to the FBI Crime Lab. So she repackaged the fingernail clippings and sent them off to the FBI and waited. The day that the results came in, Leidig was very nervous. There was a chance that she was about to look very stupid for sitting on this evidence for as long as she had. But as she sat at her computer and opened up the email with the DNA results, when she read what was on the screen, her eyes went wide. She almost couldn't believe what she was looking at, because her strategy of slow playing the investigation had totally paid off. Finally, Leidig was looking at the name of John's killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and then tested by the FBI, the following is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to John Yelnick in the early hours of April 13, 2006. The killer drove through Blairsville in their red car sometime after 12:15 a.m. A little after 12:30 a.m., they drove down a quiet residential street and pulled up to a modest little brick home, and then cut their lights. They climbed out of their car and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, but the neighborhood was dark. As quietly as they could, they crept around to the back of the house and slipped inside, going through an unlocked back door. They walked through the kitchen, then the dining room, and into the living room, where they found John asleep on the couch. The killer gripped a single-edged knife in their fist, and they raised it in the air and then brought it down on John. Instantly, John woke up screaming these horrible high-pitched screams. He put his hands up to protect himself and clawed at the killer, getting their skin under his fingernails. But the killer kept slashing and cutting at John's hands, so John rolled off the couch, desperate to get away. As John stumbled in the dark, the killer chased after him, and at some point they began to wrestle, knocking the divorce papers on the coffee table onto the floor, where John's blood splashed all over them as he flailed his wounded arms. John finally broke away and ran for the front door, but the killer was close behind, still slashing at John's back. John made it out of the living room and into the foyer, and he was reaching for the front door when the killer shoved him. John's head broke through the glass, and he made a strangled sound as the broken shards severed his jugular. The killer yanked John back into the house, wary of waking up the neighbors. By now, John was already clearly dying, but the killer decided they couldn't leave anything to chance. And so, with one brutal motion, they slashed their knife all the way across John's throat. The killer let John slump to the ground, and then they watched until John went still. Then, the killer turned and left the home. The killer was confident they would never be caught, because they knew the police in Blairsville quite literally trusted them with their lives. John's killer was not Tom Hughes, or Michelle Yelnick, or a hitman hired by Michelle. However, the killer was connected to Michelle. It was Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley, Michelle's new boyfriend. And this fact explained the unbelievably slow pace of the murder investigation, and Corporal Leidick's decision not to send all her evidence to the state police crime lab. Leidick knew Kevin Foley, and she liked and trusted him. Initially, she had not wanted to believe he could be a killer. But as soon as her investigation began, she began to hear about how much Foley seemed to hate John. In fact, he talked openly about wanting John to die, in part because of the allegations that Michelle had made, that John abused JJ. Even though those allegations were ruled unfounded, it seemed that Foley still believed them. Leidick had become increasingly paranoid that Foley was the killer and that her case would be taken over not by the Attorney General's office, but by the state police. And she was afraid that if Foley was guilty, then she couldn't trust the state police crime lab. And so to keep complete control over her investigation, she had opted to keep all those samples from the autopsy, including the fingernails, even though she knew they likely contained the DNA of John's killer. Then she slow-played her investigation, basically biding her time until she could figure out what she was going to do. And then basically her hands were tied when, a year later, the Attorney General came in and took the case over because basically Leidick looked like she was being incompetent. But when they stepped in, it gave Leidick access to the federal crime lab, the FBI crime lab. And so when she sent the samples off to them, not worried about Kevin Foley getting involved, the FBI scientists finally tested the DNA under the fingernails and found that it was a match for Kevin Foley. Foley was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michelle was not charged in connection with the case.
China, there are hundreds of these protected areas where Siberian tigers are raised. And in some of these areas, parks have been created so locals and tourists can visit the animals. One of these parks is the Battling Wildlife World Animal Park, which in addition to allowing its guests to come and look at the animals, they actually allow their guests to hop in their personal cars and drive all around the tiger enclosure completely unsupervised. Despite the almost non-existent security, the park does have one hard and fast rule, and that is at no point during the drive-through tour should anyone ever get out of their car or roll their window down. In the summer of 2016, a husband, a wife, their young daughter, and the girl's grandmother decided to go to Battling Park. After paying for an unguided tour, they opened the gates and the family rolled into the tiger enclosure inside of their white sedan. Everyone seemed to be having a great time until the wife in the front passenger seat claimed she was carsick. And so the husband slowed the car down to a complete stop and then the wife promptly got out of the car. What happens in the next 30 seconds is captured in one of the park's security cameras that was trained right down at the front of the car. After getting out, the woman shuts her door and walks around the front of the car until she's right in front of the driver's side door. She leans in to talk to her husband, and as soon as she does, a Siberian tiger comes running out of the forest off camera, lunges towards the car, grabs onto her, and pulls her off camera back into the forest. The husband immediately leaps out of the car, and he hesitates for a second because the grandmother has now opened the back door and she's jumped out as well. And so once they're both on the pavement, they shut their doors behind them and the two of them run off into the forest. Off camera, a gruesome scene would unfold. As soon as the husband and grandmother ran off into the woods, a second Siberian tiger that might have been drawn to the scene from the commotion or the smell of blood immediately leapt out and latched onto the grandmother, killing her instantly. The wife would survive the attack, but would suffer very serious injuries. As for the husband, he would escape with minor injuries, and the child who stayed in the car was totally unharmed. Following the high-profile attack, the battling park was forced to put up more signage on either end of this driving tour to make it very clear to anybody going through that they had to stay in their car with the windows up the entire time. Saying that she wasn't properly warned about the dangers of this park, the woman who survived the attack, the wife who was dragged off initially, she sued the park for $2 million US. In the wake of the accident, she claims a culture of rampant victim blaming has ruined her life. She's quoted as saying, "People's words were perhaps scarier than the mouth of a tiger." 63-year-old Kurt Kaiser was a farmer who had a knack for finding clever ways to keep his machinery up and running on his 1,500-acre hog farm in Nebraska. In the winter of 2019, when the ground was frozen solid, Kurt was having a hard time putting his fill bin underneath his grain auger, and so he did what he did best. He improvised. A grain auger is this large rotating metal screw that transports grain from one place to another. And so the way this works is, imagine this big tube where in the middle of it is this big rotating metal screw. And so the grain gets sucked in on one side, it rotates its way all the way through to the other end of the auger, and it's spit out the other. Because the auger is basically a giant rotating blade and the entry point is actually exposed, there's this big safety grate that's on the outside to make sure the only things getting sucked into the auger are really small, things like grain. Kurt realized if he removed the safety screen, he could easily fit the fill bin underneath. And so he did that, and he told himself that he would just replace the safety screen as soon as he was done. But it turned out, once that safety screen was gone, the machine actually worked a lot better. And after a couple of days of operating the auger without the screen, he just kind of forgot about it. Fast forward a few months to April 19th, 2019, and Kurt needed to move some grain from one bin to another. And so he fired up the auger that still did not have the safety screen on the outside of it, and as he was walking right near the entrance to the auger, he tripped, and he fell feet first into the opening of the auger. And right away, his left foot got sucked up into the rotating metal screw, and before he'd even fallen back onto the ground, he could tell his left foot had been cut clean off. But that wasn't the worst of it, because the rest of his leg was still getting pulled into the shaft. That screw was going to keep on turning, and he could not get to the turn-off switch. And so he immediately starts fumbling for his phone, and he realizes he doesn't have it on him. He left it in the shed. And so he's got no way to call anyone. There's no one anywhere near him. No one's going to hear him scream. And so Kurt's looking around, wondering what he's going to do as he can feel himself being pulled closer and closer to the machine. But in that moment, the adrenaline was so high for Kurt that he felt no pain. He only had one thought: survive. Kurt realized he had his pocket knife. He always carried it with him. He pulled it out, it was a 4-inch blade, and he realized he could cut his leg off. But he had to time it right. If he didn't cut through fast enough, the auger would rotate all the way around and would pull more of his leg, the area he was cutting, into the auger. So he'd have to start all over again. And so he watched the rotating screw until he could clearly see a break in his leg, and he timed it so he reached down and cut through his leg as fast as he could right before the rotation of the auger caught up again. And as soon as he cut through, he fell backwards, rolled onto his stomach, and began army crawling all the way 200 meters back to his shed, where he pulled himself up inside, he got his phone, and he called his son, and he very calmly told him that he had his leg cut off in the auger. Kurt was soon airlifted to a hospital where doctors were able to perform a real amputation on him. For a little while after his accident, Kurt was a celebrity. He was all over the news. But apparently, he just did not care at all about that. All he wanted to do was put a prosthetic on and go back to work. And sure enough, only a few weeks after having his leg ripped off by an auger, he was back out working on an auger with a prosthetic leg. On September 29th, 2015, a tropical storm named Joaquin was swirling off in the Atlantic, and forecasters were having a hard time determining how big it was going to be, how fast it was going to be, and where it was going to end up. On shore, 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson was struggling too. He was supposed to pilot his enormous cargo ship, the El Faro, from where he was in Florida all the way out to Puerto Rico, a 2,600-mile journey that would put he and the rest of his 32-person crew directly in the path of this storm. The year before, Davidson had been passed over for a promotion for a younger, more tech-savvy captain, and so now Davidson felt like he had something to prove. As he looked out over the calm water and the clear sky, he made a fateful decision. Every agency out there was telling him to not set sail until the storm had passed. But with 37 years of experience, Davidson felt differently. He felt like he could outrun this storm. Feeling suddenly motivated and confident, Davidson boarded the El Faro, hopped on the intercom, and informed his crew that they would not be waiting out the storm. Instead, they would be sailing right by it. As El Faro cast off her lines and headed southward, the governors of New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland all declared states of emergency. As the sound of El Faro's diesel engine faded over the horizon, cyclone warnings and hurricane warnings went up around the Bahamas. Schools on the islands began closing, flights were grounded, and cruise ships were diverted. Residents of one island were ordered to evacuate, and on another, police forcibly removed every occupant on this island as floodwater rose. But the first few hours of El Faro's journey were totally uneventful. But as they got closer and closer to the storm, the wind picked up and the waves grew dramatically. By nightfall, the ship was rocking so aggressively side to side that it made sleep almost impossible. By the following morning, the rain was so intense, the visibility was basically zero, and the waves were now so massive that none of the crew dared go out on the deck in fear of being swept overboard. The ship's navigator told Captain Davidson that he thought this storm was a lot worse than they were expecting, and that they should really consider turning around before it was too late. Davidson and the navigator were not the only ones up on the bridge, which is where the ship is actually steered from. There was also a black box that was anchored up on the wall behind them that recorded all of the conversations that happened up there. And the black box would record increasingly anxious conversations between the crew and Davidson as they voiced their concerns about the storm. But Davidson was totally unfazed. He was adamant that the storm was not going to get any worse than what they were seeing right then and there. And even if it did get worse, they were never going to be actually in the storm's eye, and so they weren't in any real danger. But to reassure his crew, he ordered his navigator to make a slight right so everybody on board saw they were taking a wider berth around the storm. One of the crew members, a 34-year-old woman named Danielle Randolph, was not reassured by this slight right. She was a hard worker from a military family and always followed orders, but she just could not understand why Davidson was not taking the storm seriously. And so that evening, after the sun had set, Danielle very carefully stumbled her way up the stairs to the navigational bridge because the ship is still rocking violently side to side. And when she got up there, she thought she would just check the weather for herself. The black box anchored to the wall recorded her discovery. The El Faro was not going to sidestep the storm. It was sailing directly into it. You can hear the fear and surprise as Danielle turns to Davidson and says, "We're sailing right through the eye." There was a silence on the recording as Davidson must have looked down at the computer screen that Danielle had pulled up to show him the storm and their course that was going right into it. And Davidson, after he realized his mistake, has this very eerily calm tone where he says to the navigator, "Okay, I need you to make another slight right." And he assured everybody on the bridge that that would be enough, that that would fix this mistake. But Danielle was not buying it. And so as professionally and respectfully as she could, she says to her captain, "This is a really bad idea. We really need to turn around right now. It's getting to the point where it's going to be too late and we won't be able to turn around." But Davidson wasn't having it. And so he told Danielle and the navigator and the other people on the bridge that they were not in danger, that everything's just fine. This is just like the storms he had been through when he used to work in Alaska, and they would get through this one too. Davidson was so confident in his decision making that he told them he was going to go take a nap downstairs, and if they really needed him, if something serious happened, go and get him. And with that, he left the bridge and went down to his room. As the minutes of the night ticked by, Danielle stayed up in the bridge and she braced herself against a steel girder and looked out the window at the rain that was just slashing across the window and the waves that were the size of 3-story houses crashing in on either side of them. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sky just stayed totally black because they were right outside the eye of the storm. Suddenly, under their feet, Danielle and the navigator and the other people up on the bridge heard this awful clanging metal sound as the constant rocking of the ship had finally loosened up the straps holding down these massive metal containers down in the cargo hold, and they were now loose, smashing into the inside of the ship. And then they heard an even worse sound, and the black box recorded it too. And that was the shrill of an alarm that meant Alfaro was taking on water. Danielle left the window and ran around to the radar screen to see if there was any ships in the area that might be able to help them. But when she looked, there was no blips on the screen. All the other ships had diverted to avoid this storm. Alfaro was totally alone. At the sound of the alarm, Davidson came running back up to the bridge, and you hear him on the black box, and he sounds like someone who's acting calm, but there's a tightness in his voice that he's trying to conceal the fact that he's actually probably quite scared. Because at this point, the reality was the Alfaro was now too close to the eye of the storm, and they would be unable to escape its grasp. They were going to get pulled into the eye of this hurricane. Furious with her captain, she brushed past him without saying anything, and then very carefully made her way down the stairs to her room. And the whole time she was walking, she would have been barely able to stand, because now with those loose shipping containers down in the cargo hold, the ship would rock even farther to each side, because as soon as it tilted one way, the containers would slam into the wall, driving it even farther into the water. When she finally staggered her way down and got to her door, she would have opened it up and her whole room would have been trashed. Everything that wasn't anchored down had been tossed all over the room, all over her clothes. Any furniture would have been dumped all over the room. But she didn't care about any of her stuff on the ground. She only wanted her laptop. She found it. It was on the ground. She picked it up. She put it on her desk that was bolted down, and very carefully she opened it up and she opened her email. As the alarms are shrieking in the background and she can hear the sound of these shipping containers smashing into the inside of the cargo hold, she writes this note to her mother where she tells her the winds are really bad and it looks like they're sailing right for the center of this storm. And she's about to hit send when she stops for a second. She looks at her computer screen and she adds one more line. Love to everyone. Danielle never said things like this. She was always strictly business. And so for her to put that line was an acknowledgement that this might be the last time she ever talks to her family. Shortly after Danielle hit send on that email, the ship listed hard to one side and then it stayed there. The loose containers down in the cargo hold had finally shifted the ship's center of gravity. Water immediately began pouring into the lower sections of Alfaro. Danielle knew it was only a matter of time before the water reached her, and so she leapt out of her room and ran down the hall, which was now sideways. She got to the stairwell and climbed her way up to the bridge. As soon as she got up there, all the people on the bridge were holding onto the center console so they didn't fall up against the wall, and she heard Davidson ordering the navigator to turn the ship into the wind. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort where Davidson believed the wind was so strong it would blow the ship back upright. If this didn't work, the ship was going to sink. And so the navigator began desperately turning the wheel, the lights inside of the bridge began to flicker, and the engines growled and vibrated as it churned, trying desperately to get up and over this enormous wave. But as they were just about to crest the top, the engines completely died and it went silent in the bridge. And so now that Alfaro is without power, it's just sitting idle in the middle of the storm, and it's getting smashed by these 3-story high waves, and it begins to force the nose of this giant ship to go under and stay under. Davidson breaks the silence by hitting the emergency beacon that notifies the Coast Guard, and then he screams to everybody on the bridge to go downstairs and wake everyone up. We have to get off this ship. On the black box, a new sound is heard, the abandoned ship alarm. At this point, the black box faintly picks up Davidson screaming from somewhere outside of the bridge for people to get in their rafts, get off the boat, get in the water. By this point, the back of the Alfaro would have been off the water and the nose would have been almost pointed straight down. And so Davidson is heard coming back up into the bridge, but at this point, the bridge is sideways. It's looking straight down at the water. And it's clear there is another crew member that is stuck inside of the bridge, and he's yelling out to Davidson, Cap, you gotta help me. And Davidson is trying to find him, and he's yelling for him to come to him. And the man tells him he's stuck, he can't go anywhere, he's a goner. And Davidson, with the final words uttered on this black box, would yell to this man, I'm not leaving you, it's time to come this way. and then the black box would cut out because the black box was now underwater. For 3 days, searchers could not even get close to the El Faro wreckage because of the storm. But when they did finally get there, all they could find were 3 life rings, 2 life rafts, and the starboard lifeboat that had been crushed on both sides. A Coast Guard helicopter found a body floating around some of this wreckage, but when they went down to retrieve it, it slipped under the water. 5 days after El Faro's last frantic plea for Today's story takes place in 1978, and it focuses on 5 young men that were best friends, basically inseparable, who all lived in Yuba City, California, and they came to be known as the Yuba City Five. These 5 young men were all either mildly intellectually disabled or had a mental health disability, but they were all very high functioning. Jack Hewitt was the youngest of the group. He was 24 years old. He was fairly uncomfortable in social situations and didn't do well around strangers, but around his 4 best friends, he blossomed and was incredibly funny and lighthearted and got along extremely well. Ted Wheeler was the oldest of the group. He was 32, and he kind of took a big brother approach to Jack Hewitt. He kind of looked after Jack specifically. Those two were very, very close. And Ted was known to actually occasionally make phone calls on Jack's behalf. When Jack felt uncomfortable calling a stranger on the phone, Ted would step in and be the bigger brother and make those phone calls for him. Bill Sterling was 29 years old, and he was deeply religious. He would spend a lot of his time going to the library where he would read Christian literature. Jack Madruga was 30 years old, and he was an Army veteran. However, he had been discharged from the Army after a medical evaluation determined that his IQ was too low. So he was discharged from the Army. He was the designated driver of the Yuba City Five because he was the only one of the 5 that had a driver's license. Jack loved being the driver because he loved his white and turquoise Montego, a 1969 Montego. It was like his prized possession, and he felt very proud driving the group around. Last but not least, you have Gary Mathias, who was the unofficial ringleader of the group. He was 25 years old. He also was an Army veteran, and he as well had been discharged following a medical evaluation where they diagnosed him with schizophrenia. So he was discharged and he went back home to Yuba City to move in with his parents. Initially, when he came home, he really struggled. They hadn't found a good way to manage his diagnosis, but eventually his doctor found the right mixture of medications and treatment, and he totally stabilized. And in fact was able to even hold down a job working part-time with his stepfather in his gardening business. Now, what really brought this group of 5 men together was their shared love of sports, really basketball specifically. When they got together, they were either talking about basketball, watching basketball, or playing basketball. The Gateway program that they were all enrolled in, the Voc Rehab program, they had a basketball team. And so they all played on that basketball team, and they were super passionate about that team. In February of 1978, their basketball team, along with a host of others, were slated to compete in a tournament where the winners of this tournament would get a free trip out to Los Angeles. And so the Yuba City Five was so excited about this tournament. Their tournament was supposed to start on February 25th, 1978, but their favorite basketball team, UC Davis, was playing just 50 miles away from them in Chico, California, on February 24th, so the night before their big tournament. So they decide that they want to go watch this game, right? They want to go out to Chico and root on their favorite team, but make sure they're back in time so they can get a good night's sleep before their tournament starts on the 25th. So they load up in Madruga's Montego, they drive the 50 miles out to Chico, California, and they root on their team, UC Davis, who ends up winning the game. Now, there were multiple witnesses that saw the Yuba City Five at this basketball game, so we know they were there. Following the game, the boys loaded up into Madruga's Montego, and they drove a short distance to a little convenience store in Chico where they got sodas and cartons of milk and some snacks. And the shop owner would actually say to investigators that he remembers them because they came in at about 10 p.m. and it was when he wanted to close down the shop. And so he remembers feeling annoyed when this big group, 5 men, come in and they're buying a bunch of stuff because it delayed the shop owner's ability to close down the store. That sighting at the convenience store would prove to be the last time anyone would see the boys alive. So that night, some of the boys' parents had stayed awake to wait for their son to come home. And when they didn't, and it was starting to get late, the parents started calling each other to ask if they had seen their son, and no one had. And so not only was it strange because the boys always told their parents and loved ones where they were going to be, But the idea that they would jeopardize a good night's sleep before this tournament that they had been obsessing about just seemed very, very uncharacteristic. And so by very early the next morning, all the families called the police and said something is wrong. So the police officer in charge of the investigation was Lieutenant Lance Ayers. Ayers had gone to high school with Ted Weir, so he had a personal connection to this investigation and was more motivated than perhaps he would have been otherwise to make sure they are doing everything in their power to find these boys. When the first few hours of the search don't turn anything up, Lieutenant Ayers decides that he's going to greatly expand their search radius. And it was because of this expanded search that just a few days later they were able to locate Jack Madruga's Montego car. Presumably, after the boys had gotten their snacks and drinks at the convenience store around 10 p.m., they would have been driving straight back to Yuba City because they had that big basketball tournament the next morning. But the car was found 70 miles away from Yuba City, away from Chico, up in a remote forest on a dirt road. The families of the boys had no idea. They couldn't even speculate why that car would have driven up that access road into this remote forest. There was no reason they'd be going up there, at least none that the families would have any understanding of. In addition to the strangeness surrounding why it was 70 miles away up in some remote forest, it also didn't make any sense that the boys had abandoned the vehicle. Even though it was covered in snow, there was no indication that it had been stuck in snow. There was a quarter tank of gas, so it didn't run out of gas. There were no keys in the ignition, so when the police had to hotwire it to drive it back, the car ran just fine, so there was no mechanical issues or any engine issues. They literally put it in park in the middle of nowhere and got out and left. They looked inside the vehicle and all that was in there was some wrappers and cans and cartons from the snacks that they had presumably been eating since they left that convenience store. But no keys, all the doors were shut, one window was down slightly, and some wrappers. That was it. So the search shifts to now looking exclusively in the area that this car was found. And over the first couple of days following the discovery of the car, they're looking everywhere and there's no sign of the boys. And then unfortunately, a massive snowstorm rolls in and basically covers everything to the point where it's impossible to search. And they had to abandon the search until the early spring when the snow had melted a bit. During this waiting period, the families of the boys put out rewards, were requesting information from everyone and anyone that had it. The police were fielding thousands of tips and unconfirmed sightings about where they could be, but none of it amounted to anything. They made no progress. They had no idea where these boys were. On June 4th, 1978, so just a little over 3 months after the boys had gone missing, some motorcyclists that had been on a long road trip happened to be up in those mountains on those dirt roads near where the Montego, the car, had been discovered. They were about 20 miles from that point, and they had found this cul-de-sac that they parked their bikes in, and they decided to just kind of stretch their legs, and they look down a little ways off the cul-de-sac and they see this old looking trailer, and they decide, just out of curiosity, to just kind of walk over and see what it is. It would turn out that it was a trailer maintained by the Forestry Service, but it really hadn't been upkept in a long time. And so as they're walking over, they see that one of the windows has been broken, and they think, okay, it's more than likely abandoned, and they think they're just going to open the door, poke their head in, and just see what's in there, just purely out of curiosity, because they're kind of in the middle of nowhere and they're just curious. So they go up and they open the door and they're immediately hit with this horrible, horrible smell. And they shut the door and they're like, I don't know what's in there. It smells like death. It would turn out that it was death. It was one of the Yuba City Five. It was Ted Weir, who was the oldest of the group, who looked after Jack, who was the youngest of the group. It was his body. The mystery really only deepens when you go inside the trailer. Ted Weir was found wrapped in 8 blankets on this bed inside of this trailer. His feet were badly frostbitten and gangrenous. He looked like he had lost about 50% of his body weight, and he had growth on his face, like his beard, that showed he'd been laying there almost certainly for about 13 weeks. Ted had died from a combination of starvation and from exposure to the elements. But in the trailer, in plain sight, were loads of fire-making materials. You had paperback books, you had kindling, you had matches, you had firewood. In addition to the fire-making material, there was additional clothing, heavy clothing, like for cold weather. There was lots of food, like sea rations, military sea rations, where you can basically pop it open and you have some food, enough to feed someone for at least a year. So there's food in plain sight, there's fire making supplies in plain sight, and also there was a propane tank out back that was basically full, that if they just turned it on, they could have turned on the heat inside of the trailer, and then you would have had heat for quite some time. But there was no signs that any of these supplies were ever touched. Now, one could potentially make the case that perhaps Ted, lacked the common sense to make a fire and to use up all the resources that were right in front of him. But Gary Mathias, his shoes were inside of that trailer, and Gary was in the Army, and I was in the military, and I can tell you that the number one thing you're taught, pretty much no matter where you go in the military, is how to survive. You're taught to be resourceful and to use things in front of you to stay alive. And it just seems very strange that if you had Gary in there, that he wouldn't have immediately started a fire, or at least instructed the group to start a fire and eat the food, turn on the gas tank. Those are things that are just basic life-saving skills. A day after Weir's body is found inside of that trailer, searchers discover Sterling and Madruga's remains located approximately 11 miles from where the car had been located. Their remains showed signs of significant predation. Animals had gotten to their remains, and so there wasn't much left of them. But from what was left, investigators were able to determine that both had passed away from hypothermia. 2 days after Madruga and Sterling's remains are found, Jack Hewitt's remains are found as well, 2 miles from the trailer where Weir had been found. And Jack Hewitt had also died of hypothermia. So 4 of the 5 have been located, leaving Gary Mathias, who to this day has never been found. The only thing that investigators discovered was about a quarter mile away from the trailer where Weir was found, they found a bunch of blankets and a flashlight. It seems like that could have been where Gary at one point had been, but they don't know for how long, and they don't know where he went after that. So in addition to wondering where Gary went, you gotta ask yourself, why did these 5 men drive 70 miles out of the way the day before they knew they had this big basketball tournament that they were not about to jeopardize? Why did they drive 70 miles away onto a remote dirt road in a remote forest? Why did they then suddenly park their car, turn it off, take the keys out, shut the doors, and then hike 20 miles in the dead of night in a snowstorm to some random trailer, and then get in the trailer where there's ample food, there's ample blankets and additional clothes, but use none of it and die over a 13-week period from starvation and exposure? Why? And so there's many theories as to why this happened, ranging from, Gary Mathias is somehow responsible and that's why we haven't found him yet, to they simply took a wrong turn and that's how they wound up in this mountain in the middle of nowhere. But none of it really accounts for the purposefulness of all of their travel. If they had gotten lost, police believe they would have been maybe driving in loops. They wouldn't have just driven in a straight line, reached this point in the road and then gotten out. It's not consistent with being lost. So we don't know why they wound up on that road, or why they decided to go to that trailer, or what caused them not to use the supplies, but something happened. Something forced them to do this, and to this day, we don't know what it was. So I'd love to hear your... Soon after the Beatles dissolved in 1969, one of the 4 members, John Lennon, left his native England and moved to New York City. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, took up residence in the Dakota, which is a very famous building that typically houses the rich and famous people of New York. As soon as Lennon moved to New York, he said that he felt relieved because he didn't have to worry about going outside and getting mobbed by a massive crowd of people that were obsessed with the Beatles. There were people that were huge Beatles fans in New York, but they seemed more respectful, and they would ask for his autograph, but they would mostly leave him alone. Mark David Chapman had always been a massive fan of the Beatles, with a particular interest in John Lennon. But after a 1966 interview where John Lennon, kind of off the cuff, said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, this soured Chapman's adoration of Lennon. One of Chapman's high school friends recalls around this time frame Chapman rewriting the song Imagine by John Lennon to read, "Imagine if John Lennon was dead." Chapman started referring to Lenin as a poser and said that he espoused virtues and ideals that he himself did not practice. And so in relative short order, following that 1966 interview, Chapman went from this adoring fan of the Beatles and John Lennon to really solely hating John Lennon and everything he stood for. By 1980, it's safe to say Mark Chapman had become obsessed with John Lennon. Specifically, he had become obsessed with hating John Lennon. In October of 1980, Chapman quits his job as a security guard and flies to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in the city and didn't really do much of anything. He would just periodically walk past the Dakota where John Lennon supposedly was living, but beyond that, he really didn't do anything in the city. But that would all change on December 8th, 1980. On that day, Chapman went to the Dakota and he stood right outside the entrance to this building and just waited in hopes that he might run into John Lennon. At 5 p.m. that day, John Lennon comes out with his wife Yoko Ono and they walk right past Mark Chapman, who flags them down, and he asks John if he can have his autograph. And John Lennon, even though he has a limousine waiting for him and there's people that are starting to notice that, oh, that's John Lennon, people are coming over, John still took the time to sign an autograph for Mark Chapman. He was very friendly with Mark and asked him if this is enough. Do you want anything else? And Mark said, no, that's it. That's fine. And John Lennon said, okay, take care. And John and his wife Yoko Ono turned and went into the limousine and they drove away. When the couple got back to the Dakota that night, Mark Chapman had not left. John Lennon and Yoko Ono get out of their vehicle and they walk past Mark Chapman, who's standing right outside the front door. It's unclear if Mark and John had any interaction, but as soon as they passed Mark and were making their way into the building, Mark Chapman drew a gun and shot John Lennon 4 times in the back. And John Lennon staggers into the lobby screaming, I'm shot, before collapsing and dying. And Mark Chapman, he knew what he was doing. He just stood there, put the gun back in his pocket and just waited to be arrested. Chapman's lawyers wanted him to plead insanity, but he refused and instead said, I was totally sane, I knew what I was doing, I chose to shoot John Lennon, and I plead guilty. And he was given 20 years to life in jail. And while he was in jail, he would admit that the only reason he did that was to become famous. That was it. This is the picture of Mark Chapman getting that autograph from John Lennon in front of the Dakota just hours before he would gun him down. He's still in jail today, and he actually just had his 11th parole hearing last month in August of 2020, and it was denied. On July 17, 2014, people at Amsterdam's bustling international airport began boarding Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 that was bound for Kuala Lumpur. The 283 passengers on board were from all over the world. Some were traveling for vacation, some were going home, others were just traveling for business. In addition to the 283 passengers, there were also 15 crew members that rounded out the flight to a total of 298 people on board MH17. One of the passengers, before walking down the runway to get on the flight, took a picture of the plane itself and uploaded it to Facebook and kind of jokingly captioned it, "If we go missing, this is what it looks like," in reference to another Malaysian Airlines flight, Flight 370, that had actually gone missing just a couple of months earlier. Once the boarding was complete on MH17, one of the passengers on board uploaded to Instagram a short video of passengers stuffing their luggage into bins and the captain coming over the intercom saying that, boarding is complete and it's time to turn off your cell phones as we prepare for takeoff. A 15-year-old Dutch boy named Gary Slock and his mother Petra had just sat down inside the plane and they could barely contain their excitement. The pair had signed up for what they were calling a vacation of a lifetime with a group that took single parents and their children on these lavish vacations. Gary, who was the goalkeeper for a soccer team, had been telling his family how jealous his teammates were of this trip he was about to go on with his mother. Before Gary turned off his phone, as instructed by the captain, he took a selfie of he and his mom grinning ear to ear, excited about their trip, and he uploaded it to Facebook for his friends and family to see. Gary turns off his cell phone, puts it away, and he and his mom sit back and get ready for takeoff. The plane takes off without a hitch. It gets up to cruising altitude, and it's going to be a long flight. It's about 12 hours from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, and so everybody on board is kind of settling in. They're getting their iPads out. They're getting a book out maybe. The crew is making their rounds, offering snacks and drinks, and people are looking out the window. It's a beautiful day, and everyone's just kind of settling in for a long flight. About 3 hours after takeoff, around 4 p.m., the captain of MH17 got in touch with air traffic control at the nearby airport, which was in Ukraine. The pilot told controllers that everything was fine. He was flight level 33,000 feet. The controllers acknowledged that and said, hey, there's a little bit of air traffic in the direction you're going. You need to reroute your course very slightly. The pilot acknowledged this change in course and was beginning to tell them what he was going to do next when he cut out. The controllers on the ground in Ukraine began hailing MH17 to try to get the captain back online. They couldn't reach him. The plane had sent no distress signals, and over the course of their communication, the controllers had not noticed anything abnormal. And so this sudden radio silence really didn't make any sense. Yelena Brichenko was a 20-year-old bank teller living in Ukraine who happened to be looking up right as MH17 was flying overhead. She would later say that what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she was watching, MH17 just explodes, and the people inside of the plane very clearly get ejected out of the plane. And she's watching as these people and bits of plane are falling from 33,000 feet, and they come crashing down in this huge fiery inferno. The theory, backed by US intelligence, was that pro-Russian separatists could have fired a missile at this plane thinking it was Ukrainian military. It was not. It was just civilians. All 298 people on board MH17 perished, including Gary and Petra. This is the selfie that Gary took moments before takeoff with his mother as they were excited about their vacation. Family and friends that saw this picture on Facebook would say that this image perfectly captures Gary's wonderful personality and the love that Gary and Petra had for each other. From the outside, Bart Whitaker appeared to love his family. He and his younger brother Kevin were extremely close, and Bart and his father shared a passion for long-distance cycling and would often go out and bike around the neighborhood together. Bart's family would regularly go on vacation to places like Cancun, and the pictures of Bart with his family on these vacations are always him beaming with happiness and love for his family. On December 10th, 2003, Bart, who was 23, almost 24 years old at the time, made a special announcement to his family. He told his family that he had just finished taking his final exams of his senior year at nearby Sam Houston State College and that he was going to graduate. Bart was not a natural student and frankly struggled in college, and so this was a really big announcement, and the family was really excited for him, especially his parents. And so they said, we have to go out and celebrate. And so they went out to a restaurant, and they're having this really expensive, lavish dinner. And in fact, his parents had bought a really nice Rolex watch to give to Bart if he were to graduate college. And so here he is announcing it, and they thought, you know what, now's a good time to give it to him. They give him his Rolex, and they're asking people at nearby tables to take their pictures, and everybody just seems so happy, and the parents are so proud of Bart. After they finish dinner, they're all smiles, they pile back in the family car, and they start making their drive back to Sugar Land, Texas, where the Whitaker residence was. It was inside of this upper-class suburb about 40 minutes away from Houston, Texas. On the drive home, his parents are endlessly talking about how proud they are of Bart and how excited they are for his future. They get back to their house, they pull in the driveway, and Bart's brother and parents make their way up to the front door. Bart is behind them, and he says, hey, I forgot something in the car. He turns around and goes back to the car as his brother and his parents walk into the house and are immediately gunned down by an assassin waiting inside of the Whitaker residence. Bart hears the shooting and runs back inside the house. He sees his family is down. He ends up wrestling with the shooter, who ends up shooting him but hits him in the arm before escaping the house. A neighbor hears the shooting and runs outside and sees this chaotic scene. They call 911. Police show up, and Bart's brother, Kevin, has passed away, as well as his mother. They both died on scene. As for Bart and Bart's father, they would go to the hospital and they would both make a full recovery. So this huge investigation is launched to figure out who this assassin was and why he was attacking the Whitaker family. And quickly they discovered that Bart Whitaker had hired him. Bart Whitaker wanted his family killed so he could take their money. And he had the assassin shoot him in the arm to make it look like, this was not his fault and he wasn't involved. Here's a picture from the night they were out celebrating Bart's big accomplishment that he had finished his final exams, except Bart was a total liar and he had stopped going to classes ages ago. He was failing every class and was not even close to graduating. In this picture, Bart knows that the assassin he hired is currently sitting in their house, waiting for them to return when he is going to open fire and kill Bart's family. The people in this picture with him are going to be murdered literally hours later, and he knows it. Bart was convicted in 2007 for hiring the hitman and was given the death penalty, but 40 minutes before his execution, the governor of Texas commuted his sentence to a life sentence because, oddly enough, Bart's own father, one of the people he tried to have killed, had forgiven him and did not want to see his last remaining family member be executed. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. And if you haven't done this already, please RSVP as single to the Like Button's wedding, but then show up with a +1. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My user name on both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I